Okay, good evening everyone and welcome to another webinar by UK Fight Club. My name is Ed Farron, I'll be your UK Fight Club host for this evening. My co-host Andrew Elliott is going to be monitoring the chats. And Andrew, can you just keep admitting people as they come into the waiting room? Thank you. So the webinar tonight, hopefully you've all joined for the right thing, is on tactical decision games, training combat leaders. And we are absolutely blessed today to be joined by two legends from the US Marine Corps, now retired, but in their time they were crushing it with TDGs for over 2 decades. Okay, just as to get the context of the audience, what I'd like everyone to do is, if you've been actively involved in a TDG, so not just seen one, but you've actively participated, you've written a solution and you've given your order, can you just raise your hand in the chat? Just drop a hand emoji or any emoji and just stick it in the chat. And do that now, please.
There's about 4 or 5 hands, Ed, but maybe people struggling with the raising them, but that was the number seen.
Yeah, it's good to know. Zoom and me don't always get on as well at the same time. Okay, so not many, and that pretty much is my experience as well. In fact, when I before doing this, I actually did a search on the British Army Defence Intranet for TDGs, and I only found about three sites with about sort of maybe 10, and a lot of them are actually copied from the US Army or the US Marine Corps. Which just kind of shows that it is a real gap in the training delivery that we have at the moment in units. It's not well understood. If anyone has done it, they've probably done it once as a sort of moment to impress someone else when someone had someone visiting, and it's probably not been maintained. Therefore, so hopefully we're going to get out of this webinar today is an understanding of what it takes to run them well, how easy it is to put them together. But also how useful they are in generating combat leaders and combat decision making, which is what it's all about. So I'm going to introduce the two guest speakers we have. So firstly, we've got Lieutenant Colonel Brendan McBreen, US Marine Corps retired. And secondly, we've got Mr. John F. Schmitt, also US Marine Corps retired. Now these gentlemen have been very humble and sent quite small resumes or bios for me to read out, but that just belies the impact they've had on their organization for over 2 decades. And I strongly encourage you all to go to Controversy and Clarity, a podcast that you can get for free on Apple or Spotify, and listen to their respective podcasts, and you will understand the impact they've had on the service, with TDGs and other stuff, doctrine, training, leadership, and setting the tone for generations to come. So gentlemen, you're both truly welcome. I'll just quickly run through your sort of key points that you've put on the screen before me. So Colonel McBreen has served for 25 years as an infantry officer with numerous deployments. He's led at every level from rifle platoon to battalion, and including a forward operating base in Afghanistan. He's a graduate of the School of Advanced Warfighting. He's also served in the policy sphere in the Pentagon and as a war planner for CENTCOM. And he was quite lucky to get away with ExxonMobil researching corporate innovation. So he's seen a full breadth of this from the sort of tactical edge all the way up to the strategic and into the civilian sector. He was a founding member of the Marine Corps Warfighting Lab and served on the editorial board of the Marine Corps Gazette, which will feature heavily in this webinar. He's also got some excellent professional military education PME products, orders, a user's guide, an absolutely must read for anyone who wants to deliver tactical level orders in the field. And he's got his own website, which is mentioned on his podcast, probably the longest running website that is not searched often enough, but on 2nd Battalion 5th Marines, numerous articles about training, leadership, professional education, and just how to do stuff better than we're doing it now. Brendan, do you want to say hello?
Good afternoon.
And Mr. John F. Schmitt, he actually precedes Brendan in this chronology, but I'm coming to him second. Bachelor of Sciences in Journalism from Northwestern University, commissioned 1981. Has commanded rifle, anti-armor platoons, and weapons and light armor reconnaissance companies. He's also dipped his hands in the doctrine sphere, and he's written the Keystone document FM1 Warfighting and Campaigning, Expeditionary Ops Planning, and Command and Control. He's been involved in numerous joint future operating concepts, going up to the sort of time that he was still in the still in service. And he was one of the pioneers of the tactical decision games that you're going to hear about later in this talk. And he published a book which again features heavily in this called Mastering Tactics, a Tactical Decision Game Workbook. And that's 1994, and it's still hugely relevant to today. John, would you like to say hello?
Hello, glad to be here.
Okay, great. This slide shows the 7 questions that I sort of pose as guidelines for both Brendan and John to talk to. For those of you on the chat, if you do have a question, please stick it in the chat. But we're going to go through these 7, so don't jump the gun and put them down. And we're going to start off with number 1. What is a TGG? I'd like to start with John and then go to Brendan on that, please.
Great. So, but even before I get into that, let me make a couple of points that provide some context. And the first point is that several militaries have used tactical decision games over the years, some more successfully than others. The Germans, of course, did. The US Army Tank Corps put out some really interesting ones during the Second World War, and those kind of fell into disfavor, or they just sort of died off. And so when we're talking about the instantiation of TDGs in the U.S. Marine Corps beginning 1989, 1990, right? And so that's the first thing. In order to understand TDGs, I think you have to understand that they're a direct outgrowth of the maneuver warfare reforms that were taking place in the Marine Corps at the time. This was a time when, coming out of Vietnam, the Marine Corps went through a lot of introspection, and there was a lot of institutional reform and the adoption of a new doctrine, maneuver warfare doctrine. And TDGs were a direct outgrowth of that. And when you think about it, it makes sense. I mean, maneuver warfare is a doctrine based on a decentralized command and control model in which subordinates are expected to make decisions on their own authority, on their own initiative, with an understanding of the broader situation to include the commander's intent. And in a system like that, you need to exercise the decision-making skills of your junior leaders, as compared to a centralized command and control system where you've got one decision maker at the top and everybody else is really just executing their orders. TDGs make no sense in that context. And in fact, I'd argue that you probably don't even want to use them because you don't want to encourage people making independent decisions. So TDGs really were part and parcel of that movement, and you really can only understand them in the context of that movement. So that sort of gives you a little bit of a framework for where we start. So what is a TDG? There's a few different ways of looking at it. I think it's a kind of a war game. It's sort of a low resolution simulation in one move, or maybe a couple of moves if you sort of add some new, injects into the scenario. It's an exercise designed to train real-time decision-making as opposed to planning. It's not a planning exercise. Designed to train real-time decision-making skills, provide a certain amount of stress inoculation, learn how to make those decisions under stress, improve the issuing of orders, which is a really, really important thing that Brendan will have a lot to talk about, and then to teach tactical concepts. In another sense, it's really just a tactical discussion built around a concrete event rather than occurring just in the abstract or, theoretically. And it's got a kind of structure to it. The logic is, this is your unit, these are your resources, this is your mission, this is what you know about the enemy, some stuff, but certainly not everything. Uncertainty is a big part of the way these things work. You're executing your mission, and then something unexpected happens and it throws your whole plan out of whack. And now you've got to improvise a new plan on the spot and then be able to justify why you did it, provide your rationale, and basically defend your decision in front of your peers. So that's kind of the logic of it. But that sort of unexpected thing coming out of left field is a critical part of this, because otherwise it's just a planning exercise, right? You gotta have that element that throws everything out of whack, and now you've got to come up with a new plan, right? And we called them games. We did that intentionally because we wanted to sort of make the point that these were meant to be fun and entertaining and interesting, and there was something that you would do on your own time. These weren't, just another requirement that, had to find a way to fit into your training day and that sort of stuff. And so we intentionally called them games. And I don't recall if this was right around 1989, like I said, 1990. I don't recall exactly when I read Ender's Game. If you haven't read Ender's Game, you need to read Ender's Game. It's a brilliant, brilliant book. It's really a book about maneuver warfare. But I'd suspect that I probably had read Ender's Game by that point and was kind of influenced by this idea of games, and that might have been one of the reasons we chose to call it games. But that's kind of my perspective on what they are. Brendan?
Yeah, no, I want to re-emphasize what John just said. I know we have obviously a British audience here, and it's kind of difficult to go back. The Marine Corps in the late 1980s, when I first came in, was undergoing this bubbling growth, re-examination, almost like a renaissance in the organization, the training, what we thought about leadership, what we thought about doctrine, and how we would fight in the future. And the Commandant of the Marine Corps, a large organization, it's about equivalent to the British Army, 36 battalions, not including the squadrons of aircraft, 180,000 Marines. The Commandant of the Marine Corps, Al Gray, was a very innovative thinker. And he thought that the Marine Corps was a little bit wooden, and he wrestled with a number of new ideas. At the time, he asked a captain named John Schmitt to write for him a book that became known as FMFM1, Warfighting. Basically, his philosophy of warfighting, the basic foundational document for the Marine Corps. And John did that, which is quite amazing now, 30 years past. And this created, again, a wave of excitement about rethinking how we were going to teach things. And so when I first came in, I was a number of years behind John Schmitt. He had already done a number of these things. Every Marine leader in the Marine Corps, for instance, received a letter from the Commandant with a copy of the book. And it said, read this book. And we all read John Schmitt's book called Warfighting, which was the key document on this renaissance. And one of the outgrowths of that was we need to think about tactics differently. A number of officers who had fought in Vietnam, who were then lieutenant colonels and colonels, thought that we had done a number of things in an overly wooden way, and we needed to, again, re-blue or renew our growth and our thought process on tactical training. So I came in the Marine Corps in '86. By '89, I was convinced that the organization was on the right path, doing great things, and had a great future ahead of it because it was re-examining all of its assumptions and really focusing on how to fight, which again, for me, innocently, I thought that was our main purpose. So when I first introduced the TDGs, it was as a student, an officer student. They were part of the curriculum, the instructors. Obviously, when you're in an instructor role, and some of you have been in an instructor role, you pull in new ideas, you pull in new thoughts, and all the instructors at the officer training, what we call TBS, and then later the infantry officer course, were enthusiastic and excited about the Marine Corps' renaissance. And so the first time I saw TDGs, it was as a student. And so again, I thought it was a normal part of the Marine Corps, as on a weekly basis, you sit with your peers, and there's a single piece of paper that gives you a scenario, and you come up with a solution. And then you hear your peers' solution. And I thought, wow, this is like case studies. If we were at business school, we'd be studying case studies. Each of these was a catalyst for discussion. So a TDG to me is a single piece of paper, low res, easy to do, in the dark, on the bus, in the classroom, and easily replicatable by any Marine in any location, any soldier, anywhere you go. It's a very powerful tool, and it's kind of deceiving in its simplicity. But I've done thousands of them because I was lucky enough to come in at the right time and then to work for other officers above me who also thought they were important. And I also met John Schmitt, like I said, in 1990, and we talked about his TDGs. So you got to give John Schmitt a lot of credit for this in the Marine Corps. 30 years later, we're still using them. I'm still on the faculty for one of the lieutenant's courses, and we use them every day.
Do I see that? I see that Damien O'Connell is in the room here?
I did.
Hey,
say-
John. Yeah. And hey, Brendan.
They let Damien in. Okay. All
Watch
right.
out.
So Damien's actually another key player in all of this. He's younger than Brendan and me, but he's kind of picked up the torch and is doing a lot of great stuff as well. So
I
I'm glad to
appreciate
see you, Damien. Yeah.
Thank you, John.
So do we ask the
That's
questions at the end of each
introduction.
question, Ed? How do we do it?
Yeah, no, that's great. That's great. I'm going to move us to an example of how it is formatted and published.
Sure.
So using the picture on the right here, because I think the two elements that are obvious from looking at the slide are there's a text and there's a graphic. So if one of you could just sort of say presentationally how the reader, the participant of the TGG, sort of gets it to the point where they take over, that'd be useful.
Sure. So can I do it, Brendan?
Sure, no,
Yeah, so it's one page of text basically, which lays out the situation. And the way I always like to do it is I tell you who you are, right? So you know what your perspective is, right? So you're the commander of Alpha Company, 1st Battalion, 1st Marines, and then you're told what resources you have, what attachments you may have in addition to your organic stuff, and this is your mission. This is what you know about the enemy situation. And it's always important that you make sure that you don't tell them everything, because you never know everything. And you may even put some vague or contradictory information in there to create some fog in the situation. And then the situation starts to develop and stuff starts to happen. And then things start to go wrong and because things always go wrong. And then eventually you get to what I call the trigger event. And that's sort of the big thing that happens that just changes everything and requires you now to make a decision. And if it's done well, you have what I call the oh crap response. You get that sort of twisted feeling in the pit of your stomach.
Fun, right?
Yeah, that's pretty cool.
You get that twisted feeling in the pit of your stomach. Like what am I going to do here? Right.
Yeah.
And that's the game. And that's, so you take it to that point. And then you require the student to come up with a problem. I think of it as sort of as telling a story. I mean, I'm a journalist, so I really think in terms of telling a story, and I think of it kind of as sort of as a hero quest, right? So the student is the hero, and they're going on this quest, and things start to happen, and obstacles get thrown up in their way, and they overcome them until you get sort of to the big cliffhanger, right? So, Batman hanging over the pot of burning acid, by, tied by his ankles to a fraying rope, right? And the announcer is going, how's Batman going to get out of it now? And then you stop the story and you turn it over to the student and you say, okay, you figure out how Batman got out of the situation. That's kind of the approach that I take. And so it's a page of text and it's a very simple diagram. I actually prefer just a sketch map as opposed to, a 1 to 25,000 or 1 to 50,000 tactical map, because you want to just reduce it to its essential elements. You don't want to have a lot of noise and other distractions in there. You want to reduce it down to its essential elements to get really to the crux of things very, very quickly. So a really, really simple map, no more detail than is necessary to paint the picture of a real compelling and challenging decision dilemma that you now force the students to solve and then require them to explain themselves. And the explanation, the rationale, is ultimately more important than the actual solution, because we want to understand what you're thinking, what you're seeing, and what principles you're putting into play so that we can have a discussion about those things.
John, thank you. I think that gets us to the T and the D, but I just want to bring in Brendan, because you've actually mentioned quite a lot about the sort of decision deficit in garrison training and being able to sort of get sets and reps in decision making, and then justifying your decision based off the tactical scenario or your understanding of the situation. So for you, what is the most important part of the TGG for that?
The low res aspect. I've done a number of simulations as well, and I've used simulations in training, in seminars. Obviously, as a young officer, I was keen on participating in TDGs, and as an older officer, I was keen on sharing them. So simulations are great, but there's an overhead. There's a logistics weight. There's this issue. In some ways, there's also a distraction effect. If you have a room, and you've all done it, if you have a room with a simulation going on, people become gripped. It's the Hollywood effect. They're looking at the screen and things are blowing up and it's really interesting. The TDG in its simplicity is the easiest way to get multiple reps. Each piece of paper is just moved on. I'll move another piece of paper. I can take the same scenario and invert it. Let's play the other side. Let's play it with half the troops. The single piece of paper means that the only thing in front of you is the discussion. So you can go and go and go and go. And again, when it's well coached, well led, the discussion becomes the jewel. So not to sound like, the minister when they say, hey, the church is not the building, it's the people. It's the same argument. The church is not about the fight here, it's about the people. And so I do like TDGs in that you can have a folded piece of paper in your pocket, or even easily, you can use a whiteboard or a clipboard, conceive of it, present it, and then discuss it. And you can do that, like I mentioned, almost anywhere. That's
and you
the
can do it. You can do it again and again and again. I've done Enemy Over the Bridge probably hundreds of times, and it's never been exactly the same thing each time. So because it's so flexible and because it's so unstructured, you can take it wherever the students need to go or wherever you want to take them. So it's infinitely flexible that way. And and it's always surprising. It's absolutely always surprising. I don't think I've ever facilitated a tactical decision game where I didn't go, oh, never thought of that before. 30 years later. So it's very cool that way.
And two elements I just want to draw out from both of you is the time limit and the requirement often to write the orders down on an index card, and why that is the case. This is probably going to cross into a bit of facilitation best practice, but I think it's useful to get the essence of the D before we hit the last letter of the G, which I'll come on to.
Brendan?
Sure. No, when you facilitate the TDG, you need to enforce some rules, because if you let everyone just start discussing it, it becomes sort of imperfect. Everyone says, well, I do this, I wouldn't do that. Well, if this was real, you get that normal human thing to like avoid responsibility and come up with a groupthink solution. So I think there has to be a very clean split. And when I first saw John facilitate, I was very struck with that. Everyone stops and everyone writes an order. One of John's quotes, not to take words out of his mouth, is, if you're in the room, you're in the game. Meaning there's no looky-loos, there's no one just observing. Hey, if the colonel's here, he's playing. Everyone then is forced to pick up a pen and scrawl out what they would actually do if they were in the cockpit or on the radio, and what they would say. And again, like a good Hollywood movie, you don't say, well, then I would discuss the following. No, you actually say it as if you were live, as if you were an actor pushed into this scenario. And you're forced then to say, all stations, we will do X, Y, and Z. Move the machine guns, do whatever. No one talks, and then you stop and start the discussion. So the discussion happens after you hear the order.
Yeah.
And I think that that's one of the critical pieces.
Oh,
Everyone
absolutely.
participates, everyone's forced to make a decision, an estimate, an order, and then you can muck around with discussing what was good and what's not good. And that little bit of discipline really brings it up to a much higher level than just a discussion at a table among, participants.
I think there's actually a sort of a moral component to that, right? That you've got to be willing to say, I'm going to take responsibility and take charge of the situation and make a decision, right? Because you're right. You get a lot of, I would do this and I would do that. People try to separate themselves from responsibility, and you've got to force them to say, I'm going to accept responsibility for what happens here by taking action first, and then I'll get to defend myself later. And that's one of the reasons that we created that rule, because as TDGs started getting some traction, you start to get some senior officers poking their heads in, trying to figure out what's going on here. And the first thing they would go is, I'm just here to observe, right? I'm just going to stand in the back and observe. And what they're trying to do is they're trying to insulate themselves and protect themselves from being put on the spot. And so I would have to say, sorry, sir, if you're in the room, you're in the game, because you have to feel like I could be the one put in the hot seat at any moment, right? I mean, that's the responsibility of command. Commanders in the field don't get the chance to say, well, first platoon's being ambushed right now. I'm just here to observe, right? So you have to feel like it could be you, and you have no choice but to be ready. That's the critical part of it.
Okay, the final letter in the trigram is G, which stands for game. But that often gets a bit of resistance from academics or other military types, and sometimes is replaced by an E, exercise. What are your views on calling them games versus exercises? And then how is that actually represented in the sort of second and third iterations of a TDG, where perhaps you introduce new elements or you switch around the participants' roles?
Brendan, what do you think? I kind of already gave my opinion.
Correct. And John picked the word game because it's accessible. You can play it anywhere. It does cause problems with the troglodytes. Folks who say, oh, you shouldn't read either, because reading's a waste of bloody time. I mean, there's a lot of folks who have kind of a wooden idea, and maybe it does hurt the overall effort. I like to use the word fight, because if everything an army does points toward the one goal they have, which is to fight, a lot of what we do is not fighting. And TDG is very close to fighting. It's a simulated fight. So let's fight the TDG. I have no problem with the word game, but I do know folks who have said, oh, games, and they kind of dismiss it. But I think in some ways, that's like a lot of people dismiss things. They dismiss it when they're not confident of their own abilities. They're not knowledgeable about what they're talking about. So I like that it's accessible when you use the word game. You can use it in schools. You can use it for service folks. You can use it in all kinds of educational environments. It's a game. Let's wrestle with some of the issues that you really do in real life.
Do you have any examples of how you made it more of a game in introducing new elements? So beyond the initial problem space, when someone gives a decision and a plan, and you take them to their building, to the first next problem, and you produce another problem.
Yeah, and again, John's done this 1,000 times. There's a whole bunch of techniques. Nothing's, rocket science. I typically say, hey, you're the leader of this outfit. These 3 guys, other participants, are your subordinates. Give the order to them. And then you give them a twist on the game. This is happening or this didn't happen. You throw in a hypothetical, but instead of allowing the person who gave the order to answer the question, you point to one of his subordinates. From what you understand about Ed's order, what are you going to do right now when the situation has changed, when you're surprised? And he answers back. And then Ed disagrees. That's wrong. That's not what I want you to do. And then you've created this back and forth, which very much replicates real life. People on the radio not talking to each other or not understanding what they meant. That's sort of the game-ism. You can take it as far as you want with hypotheticals or twists. You mentioned, Ed, in one of your emails, the Remagen trick, where the forces are not what you expected. They write out their order, and then right before they present it, you can remove, change. Typically, there's a change in the last paragraph of the written up piece. As you move down the road, you hear explosions off to the west. What was that? And there's a twist to it that forces you not to make essentially a long-term plan, but a very, very out of your soul, immediate response to the situation. And I think when you play with multiple people, that does add another dynamic of surprise and certainly learning when we bounce each other's ideas off each other. Does that make sense, John?
Yeah. Ed, can you scroll ahead to or backwards? Get us to another map. Another one. Yeah, this is a good one. So this is enemy over the bridge. What you can do. So first of all, one of the things I like to do also is somebody gives a plan, and then I will pick somebody else and I say, tell me what's wrong with their plan. And they hate that because nobody wants to really criticize anybody else. I like their plan, but I would do this a little differently. I said, no, tell me what's wrong with their plan. I want to force them to start arguing with each other and force them to, to have to defend themselves to each other, right? So that's a technique that I like to use. But what you're looking for is, so I present the situation. I give you 3 minutes to come up with your frag order. You give your frag order. I say, okay, you're executing your frag order. Alpha Company makes it to the top of Wharton Hill. Bravo Company's moving to the top of Hamlet Hill, but they run into, Bravo Company commander reports that he's running into dug-in infantry on the crest of Hamlet Hill. Now, what are you going to do? And so we've just sort of, he came up with one solution. He starts to implement, and of course the enemy does something unexpected, and now he's got to improvise off the improvisation. And so you can actually play this out 3 or 4 times. It requires you as a facilitator to be able to improvise yourself, right? You've got to come up with the enemy responses that are most interesting based on the plan that he gave you. So you've really got to listen to the plan that he presents, and then very quickly present a new situation that creates a new dilemma for him and for others, or you turn to the next guy and you say, okay, you were executing Brendan's plan. This happened. Now, what are you going to do? And so now so Ed is forced to actually improvise off of Brendan's original plan, even though he didn't author it himself. And you can play the thing out over 3 or 4 moves. And by the time you've done that, you've actually fought a battle.
That's great. And I've picked up on some of the comments in the chat, and it is sort of linked to one of the other questions, but a TDG is not a TEWT, a tactical exercise without troops.
Correct.
Although clearly it does have elements of that, but it is also not what we would understand a war game to be. Could you just sort of explain why it sits in the middle of those two?
Well, it doesn't have the rules that a war game has. It doesn't have the overhead that the war game, whether it's a board game or a simulation, has in terms of calculating combat power ratios and movement rates and all those kinds of things. And which is, in fact, is one of the things that attracted me to them. I'd played some war games when I was in high school, and I never really got into it because I just thought there was too much math and there was just too much overhead. You had to spend so much time just working through the mechanics and didn't get to spend enough time doing what I thought was the really fundamental stuff, which is making decisions and practicing making those decisions, and then practicing giving those orders. So this was an attempt to strip away all of that mechanical overhead and just get to the essence of command, which is making hard decisions and communicating those decisions to your subordinates. And it's different from a war game in that sense. It's different from a TEWT in the sense that a TEWT is really just kind of a planning exercise. Here's the terrain. Here's how you would go about positioning your forces. It doesn't have that element of the enemy doing something unexpected, for putting you on the horns of a dilemma and forcing you to come up with a solution and then rationalizing that solution. So it's different from a TEWT in that way.
And John, just to sort of link it back to the presentation of the TGG, a TEWT would often give you a scenario and a lot of time to plan, and you're judged on the 5-paragraph order, which is
correct.
Something you've talked about. A TGG may put you already in the execute of a plan, and then something changes, and it's that dilemma aspect and that snap decision making, and it isn't necessarily the format of the orders, although Brendan has some good theories in his paper on that. But 3 sentences in 30 seconds under fire is the sort of the point he stresses, and I'll let him come in on that. But that is the difference between a formal presentation of a plan a la a TEWT and a TDG.
Absolutely. You don't want a 5-paragraph order. In fact, when we did Enemy Over the Bridge in the Gazette, and we solicited responses from readers, we got inundated with responses. A lot of them were complete 5-paragraph, and we gave them a 5-minute time limit, I think. A lot of them were complete 5-paragraph orders that obviously they'd labored over, and they created graphics and they typed them up on their computer and that sort of thing. And they were completely unrealistic to the situation. But that was kind of the mentality. You were judged on what kind of order you wrote, not on what kind of decision you made. On the other hand, we had some guys sent in their solutions, drawn in pencil on CRAT cartons, right? The guys who got it, who understood what it was really about. And that was a cultural change that we had to sort of force the Marine Corps into. So you have to understand, it's about, what do I need to tell my subordinates? And can, how do I do it in a very concise and clear and compelling way, so that they can start acting in concert very, very quickly based on the time pressure of the situation, right? So it's not the 5-paragraph order. It's all. It is the 3 sentences in 30 seconds or 5 sentences in 50 seconds to get people moving as quickly as you can, working together.
Yeah, when I was at school, again, John had just come out with the first series, 1990. There's a colonel named Wiley, who John knows very well, and he spoke to us at TBS, and he said, when I was in Vietnam, I issued a number of orders in combat, and obviously, just like the British Army, I'm sure, anybody with good experience, everyone leans forward to pay attention. And he said, the orders I issued to my Marines in combat in Vietnam looked nothing like what you and I will learn in this classroom. And I thought about that later when I was writing out the long orders. I'm like, why is what we do so far removed from what we teach? And it's still that way in many cases. And yet, Colonel Wiley was talking about what he was trained to do in 1965, which is now whatever it is, 75, 180 years ago. It's unbelievable how we've not been able to do this. This is the real essence of combat leadership, and we haven't been able to capture it in any good way for training. And so I think this is one of the few ways that you do have to give an order to your peers in a 5 or 10 minute time period, which is a skill, not, again, generally taught well in my limited experience.
Thanks. I'm going to take Jeff's question, which, and Brendan, this is for you, because I know you did a TDG sort of series using, I think, North African Desert Campaign, where everyone was working at quite a few echelons above the level of command that they held at the time. So Jeff's question is there an echelon where, in your opinion, the value of a TDG lessens?
That's interesting. I haven't thought about that. I always liked, so the United States Marine Corps operates in battalions. We talk about large units. We do a lot of large stuff. We have a lot of specialized units. But in the end, when the Marine Corps comes ashore from a ship, it's a company coming ashore to secure an embassy. So the MEU, our forward most deployed units, are company insertion devices. So my entire career, I focused on battalion and below. Even though I went to staff college and was a big star and CENTCOM, all that kind of crap, my focus was always on how do we fix the companies, how do we fix the battalion and the warfighting companies. So I have always tended toward company level tactical training, on the argument that squad leaders know how the company operates, the battalion commander employs companies, and even someone at a higher level needs to understand how companies are working. Higher level war games tend to have the feeling of a staff planning exercise because the units are bigger, and particularly because the time is so much slower. We're going to go ashore in 7 days. We're going to move the reserve in 24 hours. And it doesn't have the immediacy or the gripping realism that a company level or below TDG has. So because I focused on my career at battalion below, I thought that was real and what the Marine Corps needs to do. I can't speak to the British Army. That's where I wanted to focus. We did a lot of stuff, again, as captains, learning how the large organizations operate, but not anticipating to be in charge of those, just being better battalion and below leaders because we understood context. If that answers the question.
I reached, Brendan, we haven't talked about this. I reached the same conclusion for different reasons. I think Brendan's exactly right about higher echelons. It gets more complex. You're working through a staff. The time horizons are elongated, and so it doesn't lend itself as well to the higher level situations. It also doesn't lend itself as well to platoon and squad level situations, although I've seen some done well, because platoon commanders and squad leaders are not fighting off a map. They're fighting off of what they see in front of them, which is much harder to represent in a TDG. And I think company and battalion is really the sweet spot for tactical decision games, because those are really the echelons at which you are primarily fighting off a map and you are making those kinds of immediate decisions in real time. And it really seems well suited to those echelons. But again, I've seen squad level problems that people have done good jobs with. It's a little harder to do.
I mean, it's also worth, I think, at this juncture to say that the tactical decision games don't have to be about combat. They can be about maintenance, logistics, tasks, anything where a decision is required. And the famous sort of non-combatant case of the Whitman affair and the advice of the commandant from the Sergeant Major of the Marine Corps and the PAO's department. John, do you want to talk to that one?
I'm not sure what you're talking about.
It's the example where Whitman's just done his massacre, and the commandant is asking for advice from the Sergeant Major of the Marine Corps, and effectively a decision is required as to whether he gets honours at his funeral or not. And it's just it's during the Vietnam War. There's a lot of anti-war press and following, and that was used as an example of a TDG that wasn't focused on combat.
Oh shit.
I'm not familiar with the case, to be honest with you, but
Okay.
yeah, they don't teach that one at TBS. So there's also sort of a subgenre that are sometimes called EDGs, or ethical decision games, that involve those kinds of ethical dilemmas as well, and we get taught those at the basic school. It's this same logic, same format. It's just that instead of making tactical decisions on a map, you're making ethical decisions about how to manage people or handle different issues and those sorts of things.
Yeah.
I've struggled.
Damien was right, actually. Damien's corrected me in the chat. It's a decision forcing case, so another alteration of the methodology, but in a different setting.
Yeah, and don't all organizations, all professions do something like that? I mean, lawyers have moot court, doctors have synthetic or what do you call it, fake bodies. Professionals have to work through their problems in a simulated environment so that they get more reps, and then certain issues can be addressed that don't come up every day, because most of us don't fight every day. Can I add one thing? The
Sure.
aspect of the level of war also has an issue sometimes in the Marine Corps. A number of my peers said, well, sure, you're an infantry officer. That's your job. My job is not that. So why should I submit to the Gazette? And I always countered by saying, everyone on the ball field knows the rules of the game. There isn't a player, pick your sport, there isn't a player on the field who doesn't know the rules of the game. Everyone in the Marine Corps, everyone in the British Army should fight, because then and only then do you understand how your role, your slice of the pie, fits in the larger piece. And so this idea that, I'm a helicopter pilot, I just fly where I'm told to fly, is a horrible attitude, because we all should understand the machinations, the decision-making. Right now at the intelligence school, when I talk to these young intelligence officers, they gain insight into what intelligence is needed by fighting a simulation and then discussing their role or how things would be different if the situation had changed. So again, even though it's small units, ground combat, typically focused on the Marine Corps in our case, it does apply to everyone in an organization, everyone who supports, contributes, has a sideline, because you have to understand how the game is played.
Okay, I want to move us on to how you've seen TDGs used well and conversely poorly, and this probably goes to sort of top tips for facilitators.
You want to start, John?
Sure. So done well, they're used to exercise decision making. They're used to give people opportunities to practice orders, and they're used to stimulate discussion, pure and simple. Done poorly, they're used they're a lecture disguised as a TDG, right? Somebody has a pet idea that he wants to get across, and so there's, he's got his solution in mind, and he wants everybody to come around to his solution, right? That's what I call a lecture disguised as a TDG. When you see those a lot, and they're pretty obvious because they come across as very contrived, and pretty transparent to people, and they tend not to lend themselves to interesting discussions because they're all pointing toward one, they're toward one answer, and you don't get an interesting discussion. So when guys already have a preconceived notion in mind and they reverse engineer a TDG to justify that, those tend not to work. When it's really a planning exercise disguised as a TDG, those tend to be kind of dry as well, because as we've discussed, TDGs aren't really good at that sort of thing. And then when they're really just an excuse to haze people, that doesn't work either. So there should be an element of stress in a TDG, because tactical decision making involves stress, but the stress should be baked into the scenario. The stress should come from, oh my God, what am I going to do here? I don't have enough time. I don't have enough resources. The enemy's coming over the hill. I've got to do something. That's where the stress should come from, not from somebody, shouting obscenities in your ear while you're trying to issue your order, which I've seen people do, thinking that's the best way to train people to be better decision makers, is to be yelling at them, while they're trying to give a 5-paragraph order. So that's TDGs done well, discussion, decision, practicing your orders, and having it out, as opposed to TDGs done badly. Brendan, over to you.
Yeah, so no, this is a great question, because I think it also benefits Ed, your audience, particularly those who haven't seen it done. When Ed asked John and I, hey, how have you seen it done well? I made like 8 little notes. And I thought I was very fortunate, because in 1990, I was a lieutenant, and in 2020, I'm an instructor of lieutenants. And so during that entire period, I have seen TDGs used in a whole host of different ways. I already mentioned the fact that at the school for lieutenants, they used TDGs to introduce tactical concepts and force lieutenants to stand up, make a decision, make an estimate, and issue an order. It was very well done in the school setting, around a table, in small groups, looking at a piece of paper. I went aboard ship 6 or 8 months later for the Desert Storm. I bought a mini whiteboard, and on the mini whiteboard, I drew a hill, and I drew a road. And on Tuesday, Wednesday, and Thursday nights, for 9 months, each of my sections, I had these large sections of anti-armor Marines. Each of the NCOs of the sections would walk through TDGs. I didn't even have the paper on the ship. We just had the whiteboard. And interestingly, the NCOs had never seen them before. And yet a whole bunch of the things that we discussed, where's the best position? What's the best defilade? Where do you get a reverse slope position? All these things supposedly were skills they knew. And it wasn't until you drew it out of them, coached them through it, that they became excited about their abilities to actually make these decisions. So the mini whiteboard was tremendous. Less than a year later, I was in Okinawa. I had a separate platoon, and we did it on Friday afternoons around the pool table. I had the paper copies with the sergeants. We laid out the paper, and we're doing it on the pool table in the barracks on Friday afternoon. Just a small tactical decision that the NCOs very much liked. So when I made captain, I became a company commander who used TDGs. As a battalion commander, I was a battalion commander who used TDGs. I was very fortunate to serve in the battalion in 5th Marines that had commanding officers who used TDGs as part of the PME. And again, I don't know what the British Army does. The Marine Corps has a concept called PME, Professional Military Education. And it's a whole bunch of different things. It's schools, it's non-resident things. But in my mind, the most important aspect of PME is unit PME, where all the officers or all the NCOs of the unit get together. In our case, it was Friday afternoons. And sometimes you have a guest speaker. Sometimes there's a presentation. Sometimes there's a historical issue. We've done tours, but many times it was a TDG. And you put up the problem and you allow the officers of the unit to wrestle with it. And this is a deployable unit that's actually increasing in front of the eyes of its commander. And I was fortunate again to work for commanders and particularly operations officers in the Marine Corps who run the training and run the planning, who were keen on this sort of training. So I did a number of TDGs as one of the officers in the battalion that was doing it on Friday afternoon. I thought that was the Marine Corps because my first 5 years were completely immersed in this technique. And it wasn't until later I found out that other folks had served in units that didn't do it at all. We had some officers join the unit who were not prepared to present at a TDG because they had not been brought up inside it. The Marine Corps, a friend of John's named Tim Jackson, had a course for all lieutenants, and it was a non-resident course. One of the volumes was 12 TDGs. This was a tactical fundamentals course, how to teach maneuver warfare. And each officer in the Marine Corps, to finish this non-resident course, had to sit down with his commanding officer, discuss the problem. The commanding officer then had to mark it off and then mail it to headquarters Marine Corps. Check, the lieutenant has gone through his training. And I thought that was a tremendous reinforcement of this tactical training, not just for infantry officers, but for all officers. And so everywhere I went after that, and obviously at that point I had a little bit of seniority, I was the one scheduling the TDGs, the map exercises, forcing the young officers and NCOs to participate in this sort of training because I was a believer. And even when I worked for a battalion commander who was not entirely sure of it, he deferred to my opinion. This is how we train, sir. This is important stuff. And so I did it for 20 years. And I thought, it's not just about me, I'm out, but it's about all the folks who had some tangential participation here. And like I said, even right now at the intelligence school, we still do TDGs on paper on a whiteboard to reinforce these issues that come up for intelligence officers. Last year, again, one of the ROTC, Reserve Officer Training Corps, the university program in America, where folks who want to become officers sign up in college, and each college has a team. They were canceled because of COVID. And so a whole bunch of these students were home, and a friend of ours put together a series of Zoom TDGs where these young officer aspirants, they want to be officers, participated at night in TDGs on Zoom. And again, when I wrote down how have I seen them done well, 8th, 9th, 10 different ways that I've seen them done well over the last 25 years. I do think it's something that everyone can do easily. And my last point on that, sorry to talk so long, is that people say it really depends on the facilitator. And I agree, it's good to have a good facilitator, but I don't want that to become a hurdle. If everyone's going to do them, then you have to do it with no one who's been a facilitator before. Let me try it out. And just like anything you learn to do, hitting a baseball, kicking a soccer ball, you do it poorly the first 5 times, or you do it marginally well, and then you get better by doing it. But I wouldn't want anyone to hesitate from diving in because they're not familiar with it. We need good facilitators, but the only way to get good facilitators is to do it.
Yeah, but I think I'd actually disagree with you a little bit, Brendan. I think everything you said is true to a point. A lot of people who started to do TDGs, especially in the beginning, were using it as a way to enforce the school solution. We're using it as a way to just sort of enforce the military decision-making process, right, and the planning process and that sort of stuff. So we had a lot of guys who just didn't get it and brought the wrong mindset to it, and it's taken decades to sort of change that mentality and to get the people to understand what we were really trying to do about it. Yeah, there aren't a lot of people that do it really, really well, but I think more and more people are starting to get it. As far as facilitating, I had 3 rules. The first one was if you're in the room, you're in the game. The second rule was all decisions in the form of the orders you will issue, because that's what commanders do. They take action by issuing orders to subordinates, and that's a skill that can be improved with practice. So force them to do that and take moral responsibility, and then let them discuss and defend themselves. And then the third rule was leave your rank at the door. The only thing that matters is the quality of your decisions and your discourse, right? And so when I do TDGs, especially online in Zoom, everybody just adopts a call sign. So you don't know that you're talking to Colonel so-and-so or Brigadier General so-and-so or Lieutenant or Lance Corporal so-and-so. It's Kelvin. And I was Hannibal, which was the call sign that my ROTC students gave me when I was an instructor. And it puts everybody on a level footing. And so I try to keep it light. I try to keep it moving. I don't want to make light of it's serious business. I don't want to make light of it in that way, but I don't want it to get too heavy and too solemn and too bogged down. I want to keep it moving, and I try to joke with people and harass people a little bit. Good-natured ribbing, which makes it easier to be critical. I think it's easier to be critical of somebody if you're doing it with a smile and making a joke out of it. So I try to maintain that kind of atmosphere in the group. I ask why. I don't tell people you're wrong and this is the right answer. When somebody says something, I say, okay, why do you think that? Explain your rationale behind that. And I try not to pass judgment. I just try to ask probing questions to get them to reveal their own assumptions, their own failures in logic, their own underlying biases and those kinds of things, and help them learn themselves rather than my just telling them what the right answer was or what they should have got out of it. I always finish by requiring everybody to tell me, what's your main takeaway from this? What did you get out of this scenario? What is the main lesson that you drew out of this? So we call in the cognitive psychology, I've been told they call this self-explanation, right? So you haven't truly learned something until you've internalized it and you can put it back out again in your own words. So I always force people to sort of consolidate, synthesize what they've learned and bring it back to me as some sort of lesson or principle or theory or something like that, because then they've really made it their own. So what you're trying to do is you're trying to lead them on this journey in which it's self-discovery and self-learning rather than you just providing them with the right answers along the way. That's how you, to me, facilitate a good TDG. A lot of questions, listen to what their answers are, probe them, and just say why a lot. When I'm stuck for something to say, I would just, my go-to is just why. Why do you say that? And get them to keep explaining. That's gotten me out of more jams than I can tell. When I didn't really know what to do with the group because I wasn't sure where we were going, I would just say, why? Tell me why are you doing that? And then figure out where they're going, and then it leads to something interesting. And another thing I do, when I'm designing a TDG, I don't design it with a preconceived notion or a solution in mind or even a training objective. I focus on just creating a really compelling and challenging dilemma. And I'm confident that if I succeed in doing that, there'll be some valuable lessons that come out of it. So I don't focus on what the end state is supposed to be. I just focus on creating really, really interesting decision dilemmas for people. And I know that it will lead to some interesting discussions and some valuable insights.
Thanks, John. Thanks, Brendan. So assuming we've got good TDGs going on in the classroom with marginal to good facilitation and people are learning, the next level up is inculcating that and getting it to be a regular drumbeat thing. So could you talk about the resistance that you might find from academics, other military, and also maybe the pressures of normal daily life to do other stuff, which often gets in the way, and some of the sort of ways that you might go about getting around that so that TDGs have a regular appearance in the sort of daily, weekly, monthly schedules of units?
Yeah. So how did we do that? We ran an insurgency. We didn't try to take over the schools and say we're going to institute tactical decision games. When I wrote the first one and showed it to some guys, we thought this is interesting. Let's see where this goes. We created what we called a TDG group at the Marine Corps University. The president of the university at that time, Brigadier General Paul Van Riper, he let us knock off work at 1400 every Friday and use his executive conference room to run them. And this is where we sort of worked out all the mechanics and presentation and how to facilitate and what makes a good TDG and what doesn't and that kind of stuff. And we started inviting people and just trying to get people interested and do sort of that ink blot sort of strategy where we just expanded outward slowly. We took them to the basic school, which is a school for lieutenants, and the expeditionary warfare school, which is the school for captains, and tried to get the instructors there interested, and just sort of grew it that way from the bottom up. It was really a grassroots movement rather than any kind of formalized dictate in the curriculum by, by the school president or the director or whatever. And we just moved slowly, just trying to convince people. I mean, it was a persuasion campaign that we just try to grow one person at a time, and then encourage those people to take it out to their, primary group and expose their primary group to it, and do it that way. And then of course we had the Gazette, which helped. And people were encouraged to send in their solutions to the Gazette. I think that helped. So what was the resistance? It was odd. They didn't really understand it. There was no structure to it. It was, it was just sort of very free form, and people weren't comfortable with that because, as a facilitator, you just had to be very agile, and you couldn't, hide behind any sort of, school solution or anything like that. I think that scared people. I think the Marine Corps was still a very mechanical, procedural type of organization, and this ran counter to that, and I think that scared people as well. Some people saw the simplicity of it and thought, well, something this simple can't possibly be very powerful or very compelling or very, very useful. And they thought in order to be valuable, it had to be some high-tech simulation or something like that with some powerful calculation engine behind it. So people resisted it that way. And the only way to change their minds was just to expose them to it and convince them and sell them on it. Right. So we were salesmen, trying to sell our product.
If I can just lag on there too, I never worked in a school in the Marine Corps. So I never had instructor duty while I was on active duty. A couple of years ago, a friend of mine asked me to come down and join the faculty here at the Marine Corps Intelligence School. So now I kind of see how the sausage is being made from a little bit of a distance. And so the sad part is, I'm sure the British Army has similar regulations. There's 56 skills that need to be taught to this class, or 24 skills, and they list all the skills, then they list the chunk of instruction, and it becomes a very difficult thing in some ways for the instructors to jam in what you have to teach. And typically nowhere on there is there tactical decision making, giving orders. There's a whole bunch of other quantitative, closed blocks of information. But the same argument people make about, well, we don't need it because it's obviously not in the list. I tend to think that's kind of sad. We've made school training into this mechanistic, here's a skill, here's a class, here's a skill, here's a class, and they try to line it up. And that's not what this is at all. This is, again, being educated, professional, understanding things. It's very squishy. There's no right answer. So it doesn't fit in our very mechanistic school model. And I think that's part of our problem.
Yeah, I agree.
In the Marine Corps, I'm not sure. I'm sure the British Army is way ahead of us on this.
If only. Brendan, one of the questions was about sort of using simulation. And I know that you use Close Combat Marine, which was a top-down constructive simulation, so issuing commands to multiple entities through a PC as it was at the time. And you had a Close Combat workbook, which had some TDGs in it, which I've seen. As simulation continues to sort of improve in graphical ability, processing power, etc., do you see that being an opportunity or a threat to the?
No. I see it as a tremendous opportunity, particularly when you're all by yourself, particularly when you're, in our case, in the Marine Corps, on ship. You can still play all kinds of simulations. I loved close combat. I know that earlier Andrew was talking about being on the team to fix combat mission for a British scenario. I was fortunate enough to be asked to go to Texas and convert close combat, the Microsoft product, into a close combat Marine product. And so I flew down there and met with a bunch of software guys, long hair and flip-flops and all that kind of crazy stuff. The Marine Corps ruined the software by trying to fix it. So I would caution you on that. The World War II simulation, which was great, when they turned it into a Marine Corps thing, the Marine Corps insisted on a bunch of mechanistic things that John just mentioned that made the close combat Marine far less playable and realistic than the actual product that had been produced by the guys with the long hair and the flip-flops, which was a sad commentary. But I really like combat mission. I like simulations. The only issue, like I mentioned earlier, is people tend to get the Hollywood effect. They get sucked in and then they're fighting, and not what I want to do, which is stop, teach, teach, teach. And so everyone here has probably seen any kind of a movie clip used in a classroom. The entire students are sucked into the movie, and the teacher, when it turns it off, all the students say, oh, I want to watch the rest of the movie. The teacher just wants to make a point, and similar things happen with simulations. People get interested in the fight, but in reality, we have to remember as professionals, the fight is merely to start the education, the process of comparing and contrasting. I also don't want to talk about winning. I know everyone's keen on winning. We're brought up to win, and everyone's a hyper type A personality. But winning in some ways also interferes with learning if you let it. Someone has to facilitate it and say, hey, I'm the coach here. Let's get back on track to what we're really here to do, which is make us all into better professionals, better leaders. But I do like the simulation. It gives you 1,000 TDGs in a period of some hours.
Great. So just to reassure everyone, there are some resources which I've compiled at the back end of this presentation before we go to questions. We'll get this available. Clearly, you can't sort of get the URLs from this, but starting on the left, you've got squad level TDGs by the maneuverist. That's how they spelt it. The collection.
Yeah, the right way. No, that isn't the right way, actually.
No, that's a spelling error.
Yeah, that's not me.
I
The
thought you
TDG
were
collection.
criticizing the American way of spelling maneuver.
It's all the same thing at the end of the day. The Marine Corps Association has the toolkit there. John's excellent book. The company leader has some as well. And then on the sort of visual video side, Brendan has sort of, you can see Brendan back in the heyday live doing his facilitation.
Yeah, look the same.
Those guys in that picture look really, really interested, though, Brendan. They look really engaged.
No, you guys love ribbing each other. Damien's got an excellent webinar with Goose, the Georgetown University Wargaming Society up there. There's a quick fight. If you've got no time, the 5-minute one by Richard Fenster is also good. And there's an article below that. And then Donald Vandergriff, I don't think we've got on this, is another good video explaining it there. And Bruce Goodmanson interviewing Donald Vandergriff in the podcast by the Pentagon Labyrinth. So these are all great resources. So if you're afraid to get into TDGs and wondering where you start with your own one, plagiarize, and learn from the best. So with that, I think we'll bring the formal presentation to an end, and we'll just start going through questions. So I'll hand over to Andrew to start picking them out from the crowd.
Thank you very much, Ed. So I've recorded everyone's questions in the chat. So if you have more, please put them in there. But bear in mind, we've got some time here, but not that much. So I'm going to start with one of the questions, which was from Anthony Curry. And it said, sirs, as the USMC, you've designed a TDG. Have you designed a TDG specifically featuring Russian naval infantry, and/or seen or got hold of Russian Navy infantry TDGs themselves? Bit of a mouthful there. Over to you.
No and no. I haven't personally. I'm not aware of anybody who has designed a scenario specifically around Russian naval infantry, and I haven't seen that they actually use any either that I'm aware of.
And the picture that's, Andrew, if you can move to the picture of Bila Zverka, I just wanted to show that for one quick. It's yeah, right there. That's actually Bila Zverka is a town in Ukraine right there. This is a scenario from the intelligence school that I wrote last week, obviously taking current operations. It doesn't have Russian naval infantry, but the only point I wanted to make was when I showed it, there was 6 of these, and each of the 6 groups of students had a different area of operations. I was struck by the fact that the students had no way to look at this dirt and start thinking about it. And immediately I was like, hold it, there's only about, in this 200 grid square area, there's only about 10 grid squares that matter. And then I thought to myself, hold it, why am I so comfortable looking at the map and defaulting to the river line, the bridge, ignoring large swaths of farmland? And why are the lieutenants, like anyone new at any skill, like overwhelmed with the large area? And I thought to myself, the reason is because we as professionals practice. every week, if you do a TDG, if you do a simulation, you start to think about the dirt. You're forced to think about the dirt. So someone like myself looks at this map and slides to the east and starts talking about that river, how it's going to work. I'm only focused on the key parts of the dirt because of my background, because of my experience doing TDGs. And that's what the lieutenants do not have. So this is a Russian example, the Russians in Ukraine, but I'm just mentioning it as a fact that TDGs don't have to be specific to a specific enemy, because your situation is going to refer to your experience with generic enemies or all sorts of enemies. I like it because it just forces you to think about dirt. As Americans, I'm not sure about Brits, we don't think about dirt. We drive over it. We don't worry about the weather. And yet dirt is 60 or 70% of any tactical problem. You need to force yourself to practice by doing TDGs and simulations. Force yourself to analyze the dirt. Anyway, that's my point on Russians.
And dirt.
And dirt. And last week in Ukraine. Watch this. Here's my comment. There are citizen soldiers in the Ukraine who have now killed more tanks than the entire Marine Corps ever. 245 years.
And on that, so there's a follow-on question from Colin that hopefully is relevant, but obviously the US Marine Corps, maybe unlike these Ukrainian partners at the minute, maybe they are, is a multi-domain organization. It's a bit of a buzzword. Have you got any examples of TDGs being used to describe the immediate taskings within the air or joint domain as tasked by Taxi 2 is the question from Colin. Over.
That gets back to the echelon question, John, right?
Yeah. I've seen some air TDGs. They're harder to do because, I mean, the map doesn't mean anything, right? Or mean as much. We like to say that you could develop TDGs for any domain, but they really do seem better suited to ground type situations. Although I've seen some interesting aviation ones, a few. But you're right about the multi-domain and the joint integration of things. Now you're pushing it up typically to higher echelons where you're getting into more of the sort of planning exercise or the staff exercise rather than the in real time executive decision exercise, which is what the TDG is really great for.
Perfect. And on that note, then we've talked about kind of the current training and education aspects. There's a question here from Henrik about, have you seen TDGs being used to inform officers of today on tomorrow's military challenges? And so they're speaking of Future Forces 2030. Obviously, the US Marine Corps has been quite bold in its decision to divest potentially, that's seen as its armor for the future. Have you seen any TDGs used to look at future problem sets?
We've already divested. Those tanks are already gone. They didn't even go into reserve anywhere. And we're sending a lot of our artillery over to Ukraine. So I think the commandant is sending the message that there's no going back. But to answer your question, yes, I've been involved in a number of DARPA programs, Defense Adaptive Red Team or Defense Adaptive Research Projects Agency, and in which we used TDGs to explore future concepts of operation for different technologies. So it requires you to just sort of envision what the future capabilities might be and then build a scenario around that. I know when the US Army was building what they called FCS, the Future Combat System, I was doing some work for them in which we envisioned sort of what they used to call rockets in a box, these robotic rocket systems that just got dropped onto a piece of terrain of, a pallet of 16 of them, which that could then just be fired remotely. We developed a lot of scenarios around different weapons capabilities and stuff like that as a way of exploring how you might use them and what the vulnerabilities of those systems were and how you might combine them with others, what combined arms looked like with those new capabilities and that sort of stuff. So yeah, that's a fairly common usage of TDGs in the R&D domain rather than specifically in training officers to make executive decisions here and now.
Perfect, gents. Thank you. And then, so there was another question in terms of this one from Adil Khan. How do you think future AIs, this is a bit of a kind of future question, make sense of the situation? Do you think they'll be able to participate within TDGs, given the fact that most kind of reinforcing learning algorithms are based so heavily on the use of maths, and ultimately TDGs are really about thinking and conversation? Do you think there'll be this idea of they'll be able to engage with them in the future?
So is the question bringing AI into TDGs or developing TDGs that somehow are able to simulate the operational use of AI?
I think from the comments, it was the last question, the first half, but it'd be interesting to get your thoughts on the second as well.
So the first half, I hope not. I hope TDGs do not evolve much with new technology, because the beauty of them is they're simple, they're unstructured, they're very, very flexible, and I think you would start to lose all of that stuff if you started trying to build, algorithms and calculations and simulations and whatnot into them. They stop being TDGs and they start being something else. I mean, the beauty, the essence of the TDG is having a discussion among professionals, and anything that gets in the way of that discussion, I think, hinders the experience. With respect to the second one, I never thought about it. I mean, I've developed TDGs where we envisioned new weapon systems. I don't know how you would develop a TDG that somehow incorporates AI into the process, because at that level of low resolution, I think it's kind of invisible whether the recommendations or the inputs are coming from another human or from an algorithm or what. Brendan, have you ever thought about this?
I have not, and I'm probably guilty of being old-fashioned, but yeah, I have not thought about that. I do know that some TDGs have capabilities or platforms that are not fielded yet, and the facilitator, a little bit of weight on his shoulders to say, this is what's capable of, this is what you can do, and there's a discussion. It's not a goal to get technical, it's a goal to envision how you might fight that. I saw the first TDG I saw with V-22s existed before I actually saw a V-22, which is our vertical takeoff. But it was very similar to a helicopter. You can use UASs, you can use helicopters, future technology in a TDG, because you just brief it and then everyone thinks about it, which is very effective as well. Think about the future, which is again what professionals are paid to do.
Perfect, gents. And then there's another question here from Renee about, can TDGs be useful for educating civilians, e.g. for college history courses? And obviously this kind of probably relates to the point you made earlier about how the process of a good TDG is conducting an estimate and maybe writing a set of orders and then having a discussion after that. Do you think there's utility potentially there?
I've done it. When I was an ROTC instructor at the University of Illinois, I taught the evolution of the art of warfare. It was a pretty popular course that a number of civilian students signed up for. And a regular part of the course was decision exercises. They were actually what Damien would call decision forcing cases, where I took the actual historical case study and I put the students in the role of the commander and said, okay, based on what we discussed about the way warfare was waged, among the ancient Greeks with their phalanxes and whatnot, how would you handle this situation? And yeah, so we did a lot of that stuff. The final exam was a TDG. There was no declarative information on the exam at all. It was, here's a situation. How would you solve this problem? So I have done it with groups of civilians. Obviously you can't get as technical, and you might have to spend more time explaining some of the capabilities of the units, and you simplify the units. You don't have tank heavy and mech heavy. You just have, tank mech teams, and they're all interchangeable. You make certain simplifications, but I think it works really well, and it's kind of fun. Oh, my students got into it. My students ate it up. Yeah.
I'm a huge believer that all professions do some sort of simulation if they're serious about what they do. And government agencies, think tanks, disaster relief organizations can all do, if not a military shaped TDG, then a TDG written specifically for their technology and their problem set. That's what professionals do.
Yeah. I do some work with law enforcement now. And one of the explicit things we use and we develop TDGs for law enforcement, one of the explicit things we will use them for is to actually do them with civil leaders, community leaders, to try to help them understand how hard the police officer's job is, so they have a little more empathy. This is, especially you go into a place where there's a lot of friction between the community and the police department, and maybe you've got some kind of consent decree or something like that where you're trying to resolve a problem. We'll actually go in and make civilian or civil leaders do these things so they have a better appreciation for what the police officers are actually doing and why, and it really changes their perspective on the whole situation.
Perfect. And I think you've answered pretty much the next question, but happy if either of you would like to elaborate. So Abby Pierce asked, to bring out and practice the essential decision-making muscles, are TDGs always combat scenarios? And I think you've answered there that you've seen law enforcement and others that aren't necessarily about combat scenarios. But the following bit of the question, and equally, when applying TDGs in non-military groups, how do they embrace the combat scenario? And I'm guessing if you both want to elaborate, but it sounds like your students really enjoyed it, and they obviously were in a non-military setting. Over.
Yes, I've also done military TDGs at the annual California Law Enforcement Symposium, and those guys absolutely ate them up. I've done them with investors, those guys and business leaders who like to think of themselves as generals, so they ate them up as well. So I think even if you're, there are TDGs in other domains, and there are military TDGs done with other domains, and they both go over pretty well, I think.
So Lewis asked the question, hopefully this answers well. Are you aware of any precedents where the TDG format has been adopted by commercial organizations? Can you see how it could be adapted to a commercial perspective? So I think here maybe it's going beyond just the training education environment, and within education, we've talked about the police force. Are there any other examples of where we've seen TDGs used outside of that?
So part of my civilian job is developing decision-making skills training programs for a number of different domains. We've developed them with child protective services. We've developed them for technology program managers to make programmatic decisions. We've developed them with firefighters. Firefighters use tactical decision games extensively. We've developed them with operators of petroleum plants, which have all kinds of things go haywire and stuff like that. They're looking at a giant screen with all these different pressure dials and stuff like that, trying to figure out why the thing's overheating. It's a different kind of TDG, but it works. We've developed them with nuclear reactor crisis managers, because these are guys who are engineers. They're not trained to be executive, leaders and decision makers. They're engineers, but yet when they have a meltdown, that one of those guys becomes the crisis manager. And so we have developed for British Energy scenarios to train crisis managers in their nuclear plants. Where else have we done it? Yes, but the point is, yes, in a lot of different domains, commercial, private, public, etc.
Perfect.
What is a business textbook that has case studies is similar. It may not be exactly the same, but it's putting a person in a situation where they have to make a decision, and then you walk through what your peers did.
No, gentlemen, thank you so much. And I think, unfortunately, we're going to have to call time there. So I'm going to look to hand back over to Ed. There's a number of announcements that we need to make. But thank you both for your contribution so much and for answering all those questions. It's been great having you on. Ed, do you want to wrap up?
Yeah, I mean, I think that the gauntlet is firmly down for us to try and get even a modicum of TDGs going in the British Army, as you've done in your time in the US Marine Corps. So thanks for your contributions, and we'll certainly be reading and rereading your works over the coming years to try and get it into some state of inculcation in the British Army, if not farther afield. One of the things we put out for this webinar was that we'll be offering some stash, the photo on the left, and Andrew has been running the numbers through our lotto machine and has 10 names. So Andrew, can you just read it out on voice, please? And then we'll reach out to those individuals by email separately.
Ed, if I may, I'm going to, rather than murder people's names and keep people here around for longer, I'm going to post it into the chat. We have a number of names, and basically if you're identified there, there will be, we'll try and touch base with you because we'll have had your email and go from there. So hopefully you've matched your name. So I'm posting it now.
Oh, that's a good number. Okay, and Brendan and John, clearly we'll send you something as well for being our guests on today.
I was looking for my name on the list.
Yeah.
Unfortunately,
Oh,
gents, your names
I thought that was you, usually hapless.
No,
No, that wasn't you, Brendan?
it was not me. I'm not usually hapless. No, Ed, I want to thank you though. If anyone's on the line, of course, they're part of the solution. The problem is always we're talking to the choir or preaching to the choir. Everyone in this room is interested in simulation training, tactical training. We just need to play the game. I mean, Paul McCartney doesn't know how to read music. A British footballer doesn't know anything about physics. He just plays the game. He fights. And what we've invented in our armies is first aid training and training courses and uniform regulations. We've invented a million ways not to fight. And what we need to do is fight. And that's what TDGs, that's what simulation, and that's what Fight Club does. So congratulations to you, Ed and Andrew, and your team.
Thanks. Coming from yourself, Brendan, that is high praise. My last announcement before I do cut the end to this webinar is that Gregor Deeming, who's not on this call, has an opportunity for serving members, regular or reserve, UK Fight Club, Tuesday, 21st of June to PA Consulting's Global Innovation and Technology Hub in Cambridgeshire, which is a nice part of the UK. Hands-on experience with innovative technologies, and I think basically a whole day at the expense of this private company. So if you are interested, just email him, and if you are a member, you'll be on the Slack, so you can get on hold of him that way. That's great. With that, I'll close the webinar. Brendan and John, if you just stay on, we'll do a bit of a closeout. Thank you.
Great. I really enjoyed it. Thank you, everybody.
Yeah, thanks for everybody.